Tonight, you're not just falling asleep. You're beginning a journey, a quiet, moonlit walk through ancient paths. As the night deepens, let the sounds of forgotten millstones, fading oil lamps, and slow footsteps guide you through a world long gone. Before we begin, if you find comfort in these gentle stories from the past, tap subscribe, leave a soft comment, and share this with someone who needs rest tonight. Your quiet support helps keep this sleepy journey going. Now, close your eyes, slow your breathing, and come with me to a time when the wheel turned slowly and history whispered you to sleep. Imagine it is still dark over the Nile. The air is cooler than it will be for the rest of the day, and the vast palace is heavy with the quiet of a night that has not yet broken. You in this exercise, the living embodiment of Horus on earth, lie on a woven mat, not much softer than the beds of the farmers you rule. The yours is covered with fine linen and padded with layers of papyrus fiber. It is not the bed of a dreamer. It is the bed of a person who must rise early to play a role larger than life. You do not wake on your own. No pharaoh is ever alone. The first sounds are not birdsong, but the faint scrape of sandals on smooth stone as the attendants come into your chamber. They carry small copper lamps that leave a faint smell of oil. This smell, a little acrid, almost like nuts burned in the pan, clings to the curtains and the air. One servant, whose only job is to speak softly and bow deeply, kneels beside your bed. He does not touch you. Instead, he murmurs a short greeting to the god in human form, and you open your eyes. You are not allowed to sit up suddenly as an ordinary man might. There is a process. The linens are folded away by two attendants while another reaches for a small alabaster jar of scented water. You rinse your mouth before you speak a single word. Your teeth are worn from years of eating bread ground with sand-laced flour. It is not painful yet, but there is a constant awareness of grit. The water is cool and carries the faint taste of crushed mint leaves. Outside, the palace is waking. In the servant courtyards, small fires are being coaxed to life for the baking of flatbread. Pigeons clatter from the rafters of the granaries. Somewhere, a scribe is already grinding ink to record the grain tallies for the day. You, however, are still in the earliest steps of your ritual, the dressing of a pharaoh even before the day's political and religious duties. The simple act of dressing is an affair of layered symbolism. First, your body is rubbed with oil, not in a luxurious massage, but in a brisk, methodical way, as though polishing a sacred statue. The oil is scented faintly with frankincense or myrrh, imported from distant lands. Every drop represents wealth and logistical labor, caravans crossing deserts, trade agreements with Punt, warehouses stacked with amphorae. The linen kills you where each day is not merely wrapped. It is folded in a way that conveys rank. Two attendants work in silent coordination, smoothing creases so that the pleats fall just so. Around your neck goes a broad collar, heavy with faience beads in blue and green, colors that recall the life-giving Nile. It is heavier than it looks, and you feel its weight on your collarbones throughout the day. On your brow rests not the full crown that will wait for ceremonial duties, but a simple headcloth the ennems. Its folds are stiff with careful starching, another task that has taken a servant hours the day before. The first audience of the day before breakfast. There is work to be done. Messengers arrive with clay tablets and papyrus scrolls. Even this early disputes are waiting. A quarrel between two temple overseers over grain storage. A request for additional stone cutters at a quarry upriver. An account from Nubia reporting the arrival of gold dust shipments. You do not read each one yourself, that is the role of the royal scribes, but their words are read aloud in a slow, deliberate tone while you sit on a low wooden chair. Your back straight. It would be easy to imagine that every decision is grand. In reality, most are tedious. You must listen to the details of river levels and approve or deny requests for canal maintenance. You must hear reports of donkey sickness from the royal stables. All the while, a servant waves a fan made of ostrich feathers, the slow rhythm creating a faint whisper in the air. The palace corridors. When the first light filters through the eastern windows, you rise for the walk to the inner courtyard. The palace corridors are long and echoing. The walls are painted with scenes of gods and victories, but you barely see them anymore. They are as familiar as the lines on your own hands. Your sandals slap softly on the polished floors. The air smells faintly of limestone dust, always present, even in the cleanest rooms, carried in from the building projects that never truly stop. As you pass, servants kneel. Some press their foreheads to the floor, others simply lower their eyes. You do not stop to speak. It is not expected. Your presence is both a blessing and a disruption. Your shadow crossing a doorway can make a cook or a potter's apprentice lose their rhythm for the rest of the day. The private garden. The first moment of personal quiet comes in the garden, enclosed by high walls to keep out both dust and the curious eyes of the city. Here, date palms sway gently, and lotus flowers float in square pools. The water smells faintly of the Nile, a mix of silt and green growth, but it is clear enough for fish to dart beneath the surface. Gardeners work silently, trimming reeds, sweeping fallen petals. You sit on a stone bench. A servant brings you a cup of beer, thick and sweet, brewed from barley. It is more like a meal than a drink. You sip slowly. In this moment, the day feels suspended between the quiet of dawn and the demands to come. But already you can hear the distant footsteps of the chief priest approaching. He comes to remind you of the temple rites you must perform before the sun is high. The weight of the day ahead. The duties of a pharaoh are not only political but deeply ceremonial. Before you can eat, you must visit the temple of Amun, where incense will curl toward the painted ceilings, and you will make offerings as the god's earthly vessel. There are speeches to give, even if they are recited in the same words every day. There are blessings to offer, petitions to heed. You know the order of events by heart. The walk to the temple, the washing of hands in the sacred basin, the placing of bread and beer before the shrine. Every step is observed, recorded, and whispered about by priests and scribes. There is no room for spontaneity. And yet, even as the Section 2, the temple path, and the weight of the god's walk from the palace garden to the temple is not far. but it is made long by ritual. You do not travel alone. Your procession moves slowly, with scribes, priests, guards, and fan bearers in attendance. Each person has a precise place in the line, a position learned over years and rarely changed. It is a living diagram of order. At the front, a pair of priests carry small censers of burning incense. The smoke drifts backward in thin blue streams, catching in your throat and clinging to your linen. The smell is sharp and resinous, frankincense mixed with something darker, perhaps myrrh or juniper. Behind them, two guards carry tall staffs topped with gilded finials shaped like papyrus flowers. These are not weapons, but emblems of authority, symbols that you walk under the protection of divine order. The street outside the palace. When you leave the palace gates, the noise of Thebes greets you. Even in the morning, the streets are busy. Donkeys bray as they pull carts stacked with jars of beer. Merchants unroll mats of figs and onions, calling to early customers. The air smells of dust, animals, and fresh bread baking in mud brick ovens. People stop what they are doing to kneel or bow their heads. Some hold out small bundles of herbs or flowers, hoping they will be taken as offerings. You do not stop. It is not the place for casual words or gestures. Any sign of favoritism could be remembered, repeated, and turned into rumor. Instead, you pass like the river's current, constant, steady, beyond the reach of any one villager. The temple forecourt. The great pylons of the temple rise ahead, their painted walls depicting victories and gods in vivid colors. The paint is still bright from the last festival, though in the high sunlight it begins to fade and flake, and the ground near the base is littered with tiny chips of blue and red pigment. The stone beneath is cool where the shadow falls, warm where the sun has touched it. Before entering, there is a pause. Water is poured over your hands from a small alabaster jug. It runs down into a bronze basin, carrying away the dust of the street. A priest murmurs the first lines of the morning liturgy, his voice even and low. You step inside the dim halls of the gods. The air changes immediately. Inside, it is cooler, the stone walls holding the night's chill. The only light comes from narrow slits high in the walls and the glow of oil lamps. The sound of the city fades to nothing. Here, every footstep echoes. The smell of incense is stronger, mingled with the faint scent of cedar from the temple doors. You walk along the central axis of the temple, your sandals whispering over smooth flagstones worn by generations of priests. Statues of gods line the hall, their faces calm and unmoving. Their eyes, inlaid with stone or glass, seem to follow you as you pass. The offering ritual. At the heart of the temple lies the sanctuary. It is a small, dimly lit chamber walled with painted scenes of gods in eternal repose. In the center stands the shrine of Amun, closed with wooden doors inlaid with gold. Only you, as Pharaoh, may open them. The high priest steps forward with the key, a bronze bar, simple yet ancient. He places it in your hand. Its weight is not much, but the gesture is heavy with symbolism. The god's dwelling will open only at your touch. You fit the key into the clasp. The wood creaks softly as you open the doors, revealing the statue of the god. It is small, perhaps no taller than your forearm, but it gleams in the lamplight, covered in gold leaf. Around its neck is a collar of fresh flowers. The offerings are brought forward: bread, beer, cuts of meat, jars of honey, and bowls of fruit. You place them carefully before the statue, murmuring the prayers you know by heart. These words are as old as the kings who ruled before you. The syllables are worn smooth with repetition, the endless repetition every morning, the same gestures, the same words, the same slow movement through the temple. Even the changing of the god's clothing is ritualized, the old garments removed, folded, and replaced with fresh linen. The statue is anointed with oil, the same oil rubbed onto your own skin earlier in the day. In the silence, the oil's scent lingers. Some days you wonder if the god hears. The priests assure you he does, but the statue's face never changes. The gestures feel like they are more for the people than for the divine, proof that the Pharaoh still performs his duties, still keeps the balance of the world. Leaving the sanctuary when the offerings are complete, the shrine doors are closed and locked again. You hand the key back to the high priest. The processional line forms once more, and you retrace your steps through the long halls, past the watching statues, and out into the blinding sunlight of the forecourt. The light is harsh after the temple's dimness. You blink against it. Already the day is warming, and the faint coolness of dawn is gone. The streets outside are louder now, the city fully awake. Back to the palace your return is slower. The duties of the temple are finished for now, but the palace holds more obligations. Audiences with officials, reviews of accounts, decisions on petitions. Somewhere in the middle of that, a meal will be taken. But it will not be a private meal. Even in eating, the Pharaoh is observed. As you pass once again through the palace gates, you hear the faint sound of music from the inner courtyard. Harps and flutes, played softly for the entertainment of guests. The smell of roasting meat drifts from the kitchens, though it is not yet midday. Servants step aside as you walk by, bowing low, eyes on the floor, and in the midst of all this you feel the weight of the morning silence, the stillness of the temple lingering like incense smoke in your mind. But the day is far from over, and one question presses forward. Will the rest of it be ruled by your will, or by the unbroken chain of duties that even a pharaoh cannot escape? Section 3. The day unfolds midday. Sun is high now, flattening the shadows in the courtyard. The limestone walls of the palace glow pale gold, their heat radiating into the air. Servants move briskly but silently, trained to pass without disturbing you. You step into the audience hall, where the real work of the day, the kind the people never see, begins. The audience hall, the room is vast, with high ceilings supported by painted columns. The floors are smooth stone, and your sandals make a faint, steady sound as you cross them. A dais waits at the far end, with the throne set in the center. It is carved from wood and overlaid with gold leaf, its armrests shaped like lions' heads. You take your place. The vizier steps forward, first unrolling a sheet of papyrus covered in neatly inked lines. These are the matters for judgment today: land disputes between farmers, complaints from temple scribes, and requests for additional workers in distant building projects. Each case is read aloud. You listen, occasionally asking a question, though often the decision is clear from the report. Sometimes the matter is small, like a boundary stone shifted after a flood. Other times it is weightier, such as a quarrel between two powerful priests. But even these are resolved within the framework of tradition. You are expected to be decisive, but never unpredictable. The petitioners, when the list is finished, the petitioners themselves are allowed forward. They kneel several paces away, their voices kept low. You are not meant to hear emotion in their words. Formality smooths every plea into the same shape. One farmer brings a bundle of dried dates as a token of respect. Another, a potter, offers a clay vessel painted with lotus flowers. These are not bribes, at least not openly, but gestures of loyalty. You accept them with a nod. The dates will go to the kitchens. The pot will join the others in the storerooms. Neither will be seen again by you, but the givers will remember this moment for the rest of their lives. The midday meal, when the audience ends, a servant approaches to lead you to the midday meal. It is served in a shaded colonnade where the air is cooler, stirred by slow-moving fans. The table is low and set with dishes of stewed lentils, roasted goose, cucumbers, bread, and bowls of figs. Beer is poured into small cups. Water is drawn from sealed jars to keep it cool and free from the dust. You eat in the presence of attendants, scribes, and sometimes visiting dignitaries. Even this is part of the performance, the living God taking sustenance, a sign that the order of the world continues. Between bites, you listen to reports from the borders or from trade caravans. News of distant places reaches you here. Ships docked at Memphis, gold arriving from Nubia, cedar logs floated down from Lebanon. The meal is simple, but heavy. When it is done, you wash your hands in a silver basin and dry them on linen cloths. The rest of the food will be taken by the servants. Nothing is wasted. The quiet chamber for a short time after eating. You are allowed privacy in the quiet chamber, a small room with shuttered windows that keep out the heat. Here, you might read from a papyrus scroll or simply sit in silence. Some pharaohs use this time to dictate letters, others to rest. You choose stillness. The air smells faintly of beeswax from the oil lamps. The sound of the palace fades, replaced by the distant hum of the city. You can almost hear the Nile in the distance, though it is likely only the wind moving through the reeds outside the palace walls. Afternoon duties. The day does not end here. By mid-afternoon, you are called to review the royal workshops. Artisans work on everything from stone statues to delicate jewelry. Their benches are covered in tiny chisels, pigments, and scraps of gold leaf. You pause to look at a nearly finished statue, a likeness of yourself, the face serene and idealized. The sculptor waits for your approval, though you both know the work will be declared acceptable. A pharaoh's likeness must always be acceptable. From the workshops, you move to the scribe's hall, where tallies of grain and goods are recorded. The air is filled with the scratch of reed pens on papyrus. Columns of numbers march down each sheet, a visual rhythm, that will continue long after you leave the room. The evening light, by the time the last duties are done, the light has shifted. The courtyard is bathed in a soft gold, the heat beginning to ease. Servants bring cool water for you to wash, pouring it slowly so it runs over your hands and into a shallow basin. You walk once more into the private garden. The lotus flowers that were open in the morning are closing now, their petals folding in on themselves. The air is cooler, carrying the faint scent of the date palms. A heron stands by the pool, motionless except for the slow tilt of its head. This is the only part of the day that belongs entirely to you. No petitions, no rituals, no eyes watching for a sign. You sit on the stone bench and watch the light fade from the sky. Somewhere beyond the walls, the city continues, children calling to each other, pots clanging in kitchens, traders closing their stalls. Reflection. It is a strange life, to be both man and God, to be the center of a world you rarely touch directly. Your days are full, yet rarely your own. Every act is witnessed, recorded, remembered. You wonder, as you watch the first stars appear, if there is truly a difference between the pharaoh and the farmer. Beyond the palace gates both rise with the sun, both labor until night, both sleep under the same sky. The only difference, perhaps, is that the farmer can choose to pause in the middle of his day and watch the river pass. You, even in your stillness, are never free from the current. Tomorrow the routine will begin again. But for now, you sit in the garden's fading light, letting the quiet settle in, knowing the morning will come sooner than you expect. Story 2. The Eternal Itch. How Ancient Pharaohs Battled Lice and Disease. Section 1. Beneath the golden headdress, the image most people hold of a pharaoh is flawless smooth skin, shimmering headdress, robes without a single crease. But beneath the gold and linen, there was a truth shared by peasants and kings alike. In Egypt, the sun was relentless. The dust was everywhere, and no one, not even a god-king, was free from the crawling itch of lice. The Nile gave life to Egypt, but it also carried the conditions for constant irritation. The warm, still air, the crowded palace quarters, and the daily contact with servants, soldiers, and supplicants meant that the pharaoh's skin and scalp were never truly private territory. Parasites did not care for status. The shaved head ritual. One of the first defenses against lice was simply removing the hair altogether. Most pharaohs, despite their elaborate crowns and wigs, shaved their heads entirely. This was done regularly, sometimes every 2 or 3 days, depending on the season. It was not a matter of self-service. 2 trusted attendants would handle the process, using bronze razors sharpened on stone. The razor's edge was not perfect. Small nicks and scratches were common. A basin of water would be set nearby, and the attendant would wet the scalp before working in slow, careful strokes. The sound was faint but distinct, a whispering scrape as the hair came away. Afterward, the skin would be rubbed with scented oil to soothe the irritation and prevent dryness. Sometimes the oil carried a faint sting, especially where the razor had bitten too deeply. But this was preferable to the crawling sensation of lice eggs clinging to the roots of hair. Wigs as armor. The wigs pharaohs are often depicted wearing were more than ornaments. They were, in a way, protective armor. Made from human hair or plant fibers, they were carefully woven, stored on stands, and treated with resins that gave them a faint, earthy scent. The wig kept the scalp shaded from the harsh sun and also created a barrier between the head and the dust that clung to everything in Egypt. Still, wigs had to be maintained. Combs made from ivory or wood were used to clean them, and fine sticks were run through the strands to dislodge anything that might be hiding there. The process could take hours, especially for ceremonial wigs, which were often heavier and more ornate. Bathing in fragments. Full immersion baths were rare for pharaohs outside of festival rituals. Water was precious and had to be carried in from the Nile. More often, attendants poured water over the body from tall jars, while another rubbed the skin with natron, a naturally occurring mineral that acted as both soap and deodorant. Natron was mildly abrasive. You could feel the grit on your skin, the way it scratched away the thin film of sweat and dust. After rinsing, the body was oiled again, not in a luxurious way, but in the practical sense of sealing in moisture and keeping the skin from cracking. In the desert air, these washings were done at least once a day, more in the hotter months. But even so, dust returned within hours. It was in the folds of linen, on the surface of the lips, in the small creases of the eyelids. The pharaoh might step out of the cleansing room gleaming like polished stone, but by midday the sun and wind would have undone the work. The palace's invisible residence lice were not the only nuisance. Fleas lived in the reed mats and wooden furniture, and mosquitoes came with the floods. Servants burned incense or smoldering bundles of herbs to drive them away, filling the rooms with a haze that sometimes stung the eyes. In the cool season, it was less of a problem. But in the height of summer, even the pharaoh's bedchamber could sound like a buzzing marsh. There were ointments for bites, often made from animal fat mixed with crushed herbs. They smelled strong, bitter, medicinal, and left a greasy sheen on the skin. It was not a fragrance that clung pleasantly to linen, but it was necessary. The alternative was infection, which even in the palace could be dangerous. The physicians. Visit the royal physician was as much a part of court life as the vizier or the high priest. He came not only when there was illness, but also for prevention, checking the skin for sores, inspecting the scalp, preparing tonics to ward off fevers. Some remedies were simple: chewing certain herbs for fresh breath, or drinking infusions meant to cool the blood. Others were elaborate, involving powdered stones, honey, and wine. The taste was often unpleasant, and some mixtures caused more stomach distress than relief. But the belief in their protective power was strong. By midday, when the ceremonial duties were done, the pharaoh might appear the picture of health: skin shining, linen crisp, eyes outlined in protective kohl. Yet beneath the wig and gold collar, the skin still itched from the morning shave, and a mosquito bite might be swelling unseen beneath the folds of cloth. And this led to a quiet, unspoken truth: being a god on earth did not protect you from being human in all the most irritating ways. But this was only part of the story. The real test of endurance came not from the lice or the heat, but from the diseases that could slip silently into the palace, carried on the breath of a courtier, or in the bite of an insect. And those battles could last a lifetime. The weight of quiet thinks the afternoon sun slants through the narrow clerestory windows, falling in soft, dusty beams on the mosaic floor. The air smells faintly of ink, not the sharp, modern scent, but something more resinous and earthy, as though it has seeped into the stones over centuries. You are seated on a low stool near the outer wall, your hands resting loosely on your knees, waiting for the next task. The librarian, a man of quiet authority, moves slowly among the shelves, his fingers trailing along the edges of scrolls as though listening for something that only he can hear. The library is not grand by imperial standards. This is no marble-clad repository of Alexandria or Athens. Here in the provincial city, the shelves are simple wooden racks, their legs capped with bronze to keep out insects. The scrolls rest horizontally, wrapped in linen to guard against dust. Some are tied with red cords, others with cords that have faded to pale brown. Your work, for now, is to check for frayed wrappings. One by one, you lift the scrolls and run your fingers along the cloth. If the fibers catch or crumble, you mark them for repair. It is tedious work, but the rhythm of it is oddly calming. Each scroll feels a little different, some stiff with age, others almost silky. Some carry a faint scent of cedar, from the chests they were once stored in. Outside the door, life in the city continues. Carts creak over paving stones, vendors call out about fresh figs and olives. A hammer rings somewhere down the street. But here, inside these walls, the noise is kept at bay. Even the librarians speak sparingly, and when they do, their voices are low and deliberate, as though each word might echo too far if released too quickly. Occasionally, someone enters. A student seeking a particular work of philosophy, a merchant wishing to consult a scroll on trade routes, or a minor official needing a copy of a land grant. Each rival is a small disruption in the stillness. They bring in the world's urgency, dust on their sandals, sweat on their tunics, the restless energy of people accustomed to movement. And yet, they are soon subdued by the quiet. They speak more slowly, step more carefully. You find yourself wondering how many years this place has existed in this manner, a small outpost of thought, hidden among the daily clamor of the streets. The marble threshold is worn smooth by decades of feet, but the silence here seems ageless, untouched by the rush of time. In the corner, a reed basket holds scrolls awaiting repair. The work of restoring them is another person's duty, but you have watched it before. The slow unwinding, the cleaning of the inner papyrus with a soft cloth, the application of a thin paste to mend tears. It is work of infinite patience, where haste would do more harm than good. The librarian approaches you now, placing a small bundle in your hands, 3 scrolls, bound together. Their wrappings are intact, but the cords are loose, the knots softened with use. Your task is to retie them. You pull the cord gently, feel the fibers shift and remake the knot. It is not difficult, but the knot must be firm enough to hold and loose enough to be untied without tearing the cloth. You think of all the hands that will one day undo it, and the hands that tied it before you. Somewhere in the back of the library, a faint creak sounds wood settling, perhaps, or the slow give of a shelf under the weight of knowledge. You realize, not for the first time, that here even the smallest sound has meaning. The drop of a reed pen into an ink jar, the faint roll of parchment unfurling, the brush of sandals on the floor. You do not know if this library will last forever. Rome itself feels unshakable, yet there are always whispers of change, of unrest, of things shifting far away. But for now, the silence is whole. The scrolls rest in their linen wrappings, the dust motes drift in the sunlight, and your fingers find the perfect tension in the cord's knot. And in this moment, it feels enough to tend to quiet things in a quiet place, where time moves at the pace of turning pages. Section 3. The last scroll before nightfall. Be late afternoon. The great library's light began to soften. It came in at an angle now, pooling along the tiled floor in wide, pale sheets. The dust hung more visibly in the air, tiny motes, drifting, each one catching the glow for a moment before settling onto a shelf or the folds of a robe. Outside, the sounds of the forum were thinning too. Fewer carts, fewer voices, just the faint echo of footsteps between the colonnades. Inside, the librarians knew it was the hour to slow their work. A man in the far alcove adjusted the wooden peg that held his wax tablet in place. He scraped a final line into the wax with his stylus, then smoothed it over gently with the flat end, the faint grayish sheen of the wax reflecting the last of the daylight. Another scholar, older, moving more carefully, placed a scroll back into its cylindrical case, then brushed his hands along the edge to ensure no sand or grit remained that might wear the papyrus. The ritual was unhurried, and perhaps that was its own kind of preservation, not just of texts, but of a way of treating the written word with deliberate respect. At the long central table, a younger assistant began laying out the fresh pieces of linen cloth that would cover the work surfaces overnight. They were plain off-white, loosely woven, but they kept dust from settling where tomorrow's reading would take place. One cloth caught the light in such a way that it glowed faintly, like a sail in the distance. The assistant paused a moment, looking at it, as though reminded of something from the coast where he'd grown up. Farther down, the chief librarian, a man whose hair was more gray than black, now walked with his hands clasped behind his back, inspecting the shelves one last time. He did not hurry. He had walked this path in the same order for decades. First the histories, then the legal texts, then the poetry, then the shelves where philosophy was kept in neat, slightly taller rows. He murmured once or twice, noting to himself which scrolls had been moved during the day. Every scroll had its proper resting place, and by the time the lamps were lit, all would be returned. The lamps were small bronze bowls set on low stands, their wicks floating in oil. When the first was lit, the room seemed briefly dark at the eye, adjusting from the day's brightness before the golden circle of flame steadied itself. The lighting was never meant to encourage work at this hour. It was only enough to see the path, to make certain one step was sure between the tables and the columns. Some of the scribes rolled up their work and slipped it into the wooden pigeonholes near the entryway. Others lingered, stretching fingers cramped from holding reed pens, rubbing a small ache from the base of the neck. The faint smell of warmed oil, mingled with papyrus dust, was a sign that the day's pace had ended. One could not rush here. Not the reading, not the copying, not the returning of scrolls, and so even the end of the day carried the same quiet dignity as the beginning. A single visitor remained, hunched over a scroll in the western alcove. The librarian approached, slowly, not to hurry him, but simply to let him know the hour. The man looked up, blinked as though returning from another world, and nodded. He rose, brushed a small crease from his tunic, and carefully rewound the scroll before placing it into the librarian's waiting hands. The great doors would close soon. They were tall enough that it took 2 men to pull them, the bronze fittings cool under their palms. As they swung shut, the sound was less of a slam and more of a deep, measured sigh, like the building itself settling into the evening. Outside, the light was fading into a soft, smoky blue. Inside, the last of the lamps flickered against the stone walls, their reflections stretching long across the floor. By nightfall, the library would be still. The scrolls would sleep in their niches, the wax tablets in their trays, the ink jars capped and covered. If anyone were to pass by, they might hear only the faintest creak of the timber beams settling, or the whisper of a mouse brushing past. A stack of linen covers. It was a silence made not by emptiness, but by the gentle custody of thousands of voices, waiting patiently, endlessly to be read again. And in that silence, the city itself seemed to lean closer, as though the library's quiet heart pulsed faintly through the stones of Rome. Story 3. Dining with the Divine. Pharaoh's Table and the Burden of Eating Like a God. Section 1. The morning meal in the house of Etenitiate is just before dawn in the palace of Thebes. In the time when the Nile has recently flooded and the fields are still damp with the smell of wet earth. The sky beyond the great courtyard is fading from black to a soft, bruised blue, and the breeze carries the scent of lotus from the palace gardens. The servants have been awake for hours. The kitchens, built apart from the main palace to keep the heat and smoke away from the living quarters, are already busy with the low thud of pestles in mortars and the hiss of water poured into hot bronze pans. The sound of grinding is constant, for bread is not simply a thing to be bought or fetched. It is born each morning in these stone-walled rooms, from grain to loaf. The Pharaoh himself will not rise for some time yet, but the food must be ready. There is a ritual to eating in Egypt's royal household, and timing is a part of the ritual. The morning meal is not the largest of the day, yet it sets the tone for everything that follows. Every detail, from the temperature of the honey to the brightness of the figs, is to be perfect. A palace scribe, seated cross-legged with a reed pen in hand, keeps a record of the foods prepared. Not because the Pharaoh will read it, but because order is the breath of a well-run court. The list is recited aloud: flatbreads of emmer wheat, a honeyed cake for the morning sweetness, a jug of fresh cow's milk, cooled overnight in the shade of the cellar, a bowl of dates, their skins wrinkled but their insides soft and caramel sweet. There is beer, too, not the thick drink of the farmers, but a strained, lighter brew fit for noble lips. In the kitchens, a cook slices a small Nile perch. It will be lightly poached, seasoned with coriander, and a pinch of salt from the distant oases. Salt is a treasure, carried hundreds of miles and weighed carefully before use, and so even the Pharaoh's fish receives it sparingly. This is not a place for haste. Even the way the bread is kneaded is deliberate: long, slow presses of the palm against the dough, the same way it has been done for centuries. In the far corner, a servant tends to a brazier, warming a small copper pot of honey until it is thin enough to drizzle without clumping. The air is thick with smells: yeast, smoke, and the faint tang of fish and herbs. When the time is near, attendants carry the food to the royal dining chamber. The room is not vast like a banquet hall. Rather, it is intimate, designed for comfort and for the enjoyment of each bite without distraction. The pharaoh will eat seated, perhaps with a favored queen or a visiting priest. A servant will pour cool water over his hands before he touches the bread. Another will fan the air gently, keeping fellows away. No one speaks unless addressed. The act of eating is both nourishment and ceremony. To dine in this way is to remind the court that the pharaoh is more than a man. He is a living god, and what he consumes must be worthy of divinity. Yet there is a quiet burden to it too, for while the bread is soft, and the honey sweet, and the fish tender, each morsel is expected to be perfect. Nothing burnt, nothing undercanned, nothing unworthy. A god cannot eat carelessly, and so every morning meal is as much a performance as it is a comfort, a show for an audience that exists in the mind of the eater as much as in the eyes of the court. Outside, the sun clears the palace walls, and the city of Thebes stirs awake. The river glints gold in the distance. But here, in the cool shadows of the royal chamber, the pharaoh's first bite of bread is the true beginning of the day. Section to the machinery behind a royal meal. If the pharaoh's table was a stage, then the kitchens of the palace were the hidden machinery that made the performance possible. Few of those who dined in the grand halls ever saw the sweat, smoke, and endless movement that preceded the arrival of a dish. Even fewer understood that a single plate of honey-glazed goose could require dozens of hands and sometimes weeks of preparation before it was worthy of being set before the god king. The palace kitchens were not a single room but a network of interconnected spaces, each one dedicated to a particular craft. In one courtyard, butchers worked beneath reed canopies, their hands red as they processed goats, ducks, and oxen brought in from royal estates. In another shaded corner, fishmongers scaled Nile perch and tilapia, their scales catching the sunlight, before being swept into baskets for the compost pits. There was a bakery the size of a small village workshop, where rows upon rows of conical clay molds were heated to bake bread, some of it coarse for the workers, some of it enriched with figs, dates, or coriander for the royal household. Bread alone could occupy an entire day's work. Palace bakers would sift the finest emmer flour, mix it with water and a touch of honey, and knead it into smooth, elastic dough. Special loaves intended for Pharaoh might be molded into elaborate shapes: a lotus blossom, a falcon's wing before being baked. The head baker's assistants would check each loaf for cracks or imperfections, discarding those that failed the royal standard. In the spice and herb room, fragrant jars lined the shelves: cumin, coriander, fenugreek, marjoram, and imported cinnamon from far-off lands. Certain ingredients were so rare that they arrived in sealed containers, to be opened only by a trusted steward. Every grain of spice was precious, for some had traveled across deserts and seas, carried on camel caravans or Phoenician ships. And then there was the kitchen staff, the living heart of the operation. Each role was highly specialized. The nefet, or chief cook, was responsible for the final seasoning of royal dishes. The hesib, or provisioner, oversaw the careful accounting of ingredients, ensuring nothing was wasted or stolen. Young boys fanned the embers in the ovens, while older apprentices learned the slow, patient skill of roasting meat so that the skin crisped without burning. It was not a place of quiet. The clang of bronze knives against wooden boards, the hiss of fat dripping onto hot coals, the rhythmic pounding of grain in mortars, it all blended into a constant, low roar of productivity. Even the air was thick with a tapestry of scents: roasting duck, freshly baked bread, sharp coriander, and the earthy tang of onions. But all of this bustle was governed by one inescapable truth: Pharaoh's meals had to be perfect, not simply because he was a king, but because every dish placed before him was a kind of offering to a god. A poorly cooked goose or a stale loaf was not just a kitchen failure, it was an act of irreverence. And the burden of such perfection fell on everyone, from the smallest pot boy to the master chef. Beyond the kitchens, another layer of labor ensured these meals were possible: the network of farmers, fishermen, herdsmen, and traders who supplied the palace. Vast estates belonging to the crown produced the grain, fruits, and livestock needed for daily feasts. Fishermen delivered their catch to riverfront docks where palace servants waited. Traders from Nubia brought ivory, incense, and sometimes even exotic game. The process of getting food to the palace was itself an act of logistics on a grand scale. Ox-drawn carts carried amphorae of beer and oil. Porters balanced baskets of things on their shoulders. Scribes recorded each delivery in careful hieroglyphs. A missing shipment was no small matter if the fish were delayed. The evening banquet would have to be altered, and altering a royal menu was a dangerous proposition. It is easy to imagine Pharaoh simply walking into his hall and sitting down to eat, but in truth, the act of placing food before him was the culmination of an empire's worth of labor. The kitchens were an unseen engine that ran every day without pause, fueled by the constant pressure of divine expectation. And every servant within that engine knew that a single mistake could carry consequences far beyond the loss of a meal. Because when you fed a god, failure was not simply unacceptable, it was unthinkable. Section 3. The weight of splendor be the time the sun sinks low over the palm-dotted horizon. The palace is bathed in molten gold. The evening light seeps through the carved stone windows, pooling over the banquet hall where the pharaoh's dinner will soon begin. The room is cavernous, designed not only to seat the royal household, but to impress any foreign envoy, priest, or favored courtier allowed inside. The polished limestone floors reflect the flicker of hundreds of oil lamps, each carefully trimmed, so that their flames burn steady and bright. The table, a long, low platform of cedar imported from distant Lebanon, is set with gold inlaid bowls, silver ladles, and plates of polished faience, each piece a testament to Egypt's reach. Across seas and deserts, servants move quietly, their linen kilts whispering as they pass, placing delicately prepared dishes in perfect symmetry. The air carries the aromas of roasting fowl duck, goose, and pigeon alongside the sweet, heady scent of honey glazed dates and figs. There is bread shaped like lotus blossoms, its dough scented faintly with coriander and fenugreek. Bowls of lentil stew, rich with cumin, sit beside platters of tilapia pulled fresh from the Nile and poached in wine. Some of these dishes are served not because the pharaoh CIVs them, but because tradition demands they appear symbols of fertility, abundance, and the divine cycle of life. The pharaoh arrives at last, walking slowly, as if every step is part of a performance. His gold color catches the lamplight, dazzling the eyes of the guests. He does not sit in the middle of the table as a common man might, but slightly elevated, on a cushioned dais. This is not merely for comfort, it is to remind everyone that his presence is above theirs, even when eating. The meal begins with a ritual offering. A priest presents the first dish to the gods, a platter of bread, beer, and roasted meat placed upon a small altar at the edge of the hall. Only after the divine share is given may the pharaoh take his first bite. Every motion is deliberate, as though even the act of chewing must be worthy of a god king. For the courtiers, eating at the pharaoh's table is both an honor and a trial. The rules are strict. No one may begin before he does. No one may speak unless addressed. Even the way one breaks bread is dictated. It must be done with care, never tearing it crudely. Wine is poured not freely but ceremonially, and though the amphorae are plentiful, it would be unthinkable to appear too eager. And for the pharaoh himself, this splendor is its own kind of burden. His meals are a stage, and the audience expects perfection. A moment's clumsiness, a sign of distaste for a dish, could be taken as an omen. He must eat what is placed before him, whether or not he desires it, for every ingredient has been chosen for its symbolic weight. The duck is not just poultry, it is a sign of rebirth. The lotus-shaped bread is not merely decorative, it is a reminder of creation from the primeval waters. As the night deepens, musicians play softly harps, flutes, and the gentle rattle of sistrums. Servants replenish platters with clockwork precision, though much of the food will go untouched. What is left will be distributed to temple kitchens or given to favored servants, the divine bounty filtering down to mortal hands. By the end, the pharaoh rises, signaling the feast is over. Guests stand immediately, bowing low. The hall begins to empty. The golden plates and goblets carried away, the lamps extinguished one by one until only the altar remains lit a faint glow for the gods, who, it is believed, will feast through the night. And outside, in the dark streets beyond the palace, the common people eat their own dinners: coarse bread, onions, maybe a handful of beans. They may never set foot in the banquet hall, but they too know the Pharaoh eats for them, as much as for himself, an eternal, gilded performance in which the God King must always play his part. Story 4, Section 1. The weight of a Stanith sun is still low when the shutters creak open. They are not loud, not the clattering of iron hinges on a fortress gate, but the steady, tired groan of wood that has swelled and dried too many times to count. From the street, the market is still a skeleton. Stalls half assembled, canopies slack and wrinkled from the night's cool damp. But here, inside the small, deep shop wedged between a spice seller's window and a cord maker's doorway, the day begins differently. The merchant moves without speaking and without hurry. His fingers find the familiar grooves on a shelf where the balances rest. The great beam scale for sacks, the smaller brass scale for coins, and the smallest of all, no larger than a man's palm, for measuring powders, oils, and the kind of goods you do not simply guess at. Beside the scales lie the stones, not pebbles, not random rocks from the street, but cut and smoothed weights, each shaped to a known value. The oldest are black basalt, edges rounded from years of handling. Others are bright bronze, their surfaces dulled with patina. A few are newer, pale limestone, carved so cleanly the marks of the chisel still catch the light. They are cool to the touch this morning, the air not yet warmed by the sun. He sets them in a neat line, smallest to largest, as his father once did. The first customer will not arrive for another hour, perhaps two. But the weights must be ready. They are the bones of trust in the market, more than the merchant's smile, more than his word. Without them, he could not trade honestly, nor prove that he had traded honestly when someone doubted him. He remembers faintly a day when the market weights were tested. The official came from the city's granary, carrying a leather case of his own stones. Each was wrapped in linen, labeled with red ink. The man spoke little, but he looked long at every weight and every mark carved into their sides. A crooked chisel line meant the stone had been filed, worn down, and a worn-down weight meant someone might be cheating. It had not been the merchant's shop under suspicion, but still, his heart had been uneasy. A man can live a lifetime on trust and lose it in a single morning. Today, the only inspection comes from his own eye. He picks up the smallest basalt stone, holds it to the light. Its edges shine faintly where his thumb has worn them smooth. He sets it down again, the soft clink like the note of a small bell. Outside, the market begins to stir. A mule passes, its hooves dull on the packed earth. The air smells faintly of damp straw and yesterday's ashes. Somewhere a boy is calling out in sing-song, hawking flatbread still warm from the oven, but inside, the room is still a little cool, a little dark. The merchant ties the canopy rope, dusts the shelf, and waits, surrounded not by treasures, but by the quiet weight of stone. Section 2. The slow grind. The first thing you hear is not the sound of birds or the lowing of cattle, but the rasping of stone on stone. Before the sun has fully risen, the grinding has begun. It is a rhythm so constant in the village that you do not notice it until you try to sleep past dawn. 2 stones, one flat, one shaped to fit the hands, drag back and forth over a pile of grain, crushing it into flour. There is no rush, because the rush will come later. Right now, the work is slow, steady, and never-ending. The women who grind sit on woven mats, legs folded to one side, bodies angled forward. The stones are heavy enough to numb the fingers, but light enough to move in a steady arc. With each pass, the coarse grains crack, then splinter, then begin to powder. The flour will not be white, it will be flecked with bits of husk, small and sharp, just as all bread in this place is. It will stick in the teeth and wear down the molars over years, but that is simply the way of things around them. Children dart in and out, sometimes carrying water, sometimes scooping spilled grain from the reed mat. Nothing is wasted, not even what a mouse has nibbled. Grain is life, and every kernel has been earned by sweat, risk, and the favor of the river. By mid-morning, the grinding stones grow warm from constant friction. Hands are coated with a fine dust that clings to the skin, mixing with sweat into a paste. It works its way under the nails and between the lines of the palm. This is the same paste that will be kneaded with water to become dough. It will return to the bread, whether you intend it or not. At the other side of the courtyard, another team begins sifting. Woven baskets are used like sieves, shaking the flour so the larger fragments remain behind. There is no true separation. Every loaf will still crunch between the teeth, but the act of sifting makes the bread cook more evenly. Besides, it is a gesture of care, proof that the household has taken the trouble to make it as fine as possible. The oven, a beehive-shaped clay dome, waits for its fire. But wood is precious, so before it can be lit, a boy is sent to the riverbank to gather dry reeds. He will bring back an armful that smells faintly of mud and fish, perfect for the quick, hot blaze needed to bake the flat rounds. By midday, the dough has been mixed flour, water, and a pinch of salt, if the family can spare it. Sometimes sourdough starter is added, carried from yesterday's loaf to today's, a chain of bread stretching back generations. It smells faintly sour, faintly sweet, a living thing that bridges the past and the present. The women roll and pat the dough into discs, not too thick, not too thin. They dust them lightly so they will not stick, and stack them under a cloth to rest. Even here there is patience. The bread will come when the bread is ready, not sooner, and still the grinding continues in the background, because tomorrow they will need bread again, and the day after, and the day after that. The bread never stops. Neither do the hands that make it. Section 3. The long shadow of the bread line. By the time the midday sun dipped past its highest point, the air in the bakery district had grown heavy with the smell of yeast and damp flour. The crowd along the bread line had shifted. though never fully disappeared. Mourning pious mothers with young children in tow had given way to older men, workers returning from half-day labors, and errand boys clutching reed baskets to carry home the daily rations. The soundscape changed with them. Fewer crying infants, more low conversation, and the occasional bark of a trader hawking onions or dried figs from a nearby stall. At the very end of the queue stood Mary, a widower in his late 60s, leaning on a polished walking stick. He had worked most of his life on the river docks, hauling crates and coiling ropes, until his knees refused to bend without pain. Now his days revolved around this line, arriving just late enough to avoid the morning crush, but early enough to find bread before the ovens cooled. His neighbor once joked that the line was his new workplace, but to Mary, it was more than routine. It was one of the few places left in the city where he could still belong to the slow rhythm of public life. Inside the bakery, the great communal oven was cooling, its heat having poured into the street all morning. A faint crackling came from the crust of the last loaves, stacked on reed mats to rest before sale. The baker, Hannah, wiped flour from her forehead and exchanged a look with her apprentice. The crowd had been patient today, but the store of grain from the granary was noticeably less than last week. The price of barley had risen after an unseasonal flood upstream, and though the Pharaohs' officials swore that the state had secured enough reserves, every baker knew what secured meant: bread made with a little more chaff, stretched further with emmer and millet, a coarser crumb that filled the stomach but dulled the taste. As Mary reached the counter, Hannah slid a warm, heavy loaf into his basket. They exchanged the usual pleasantries: weather, prices, the rumor that the Temple of Amun would be hosting a free meal for the Feast of Opit. But Mary didn't linger. He knew the smell of fresh bread would follow him home, and he still had 2 barter 4 leeks and a pinch of coriander from the spice vendor before the market wound down. Elsewhere in the city, at the Grand Temple kitchens, the day's baking was not yet over. Servants bustled between towering storerooms, carrying trays laden with sweetened loaves shaped into the form of geese or fish, gifts for the gods. The difference between the bread in Mary's basket and the bread laid before the temple altars was striking, not only in flavor, but in purpose. One nourished the living, the other was meant for the divine, though most would be eaten later by priests, scribes, and attendants. This dual economy of bread, common and sacred, was as old as the city itself. By sunset, the bread line was gone, the ovens empty. In the streets, children kicked at the hard crusts they had scavenged from the day's sweepings, while dogs sniffed at crumbs caught in the cracks of the paving stones. Inside Mary's home, the loaf sat on the table, its surface still faintly warm, marked with the thumbprint Hannah had pressed into it before baking. He would slice it sparingly, spreading it over 3 meals, softening stale pieces in broth when needed. The city exhaled into evening. Smoke from cook fires curled into the darkening sky. Somewhere the priests were offering their last libations and breaking the temple loaves, just as Mary tore off his first piece and chewed slowly, eyes half closed, tasting not just flour and salt, but the comfort of having secured bread for another day. Story 5. Feeding the forgotten meals in the margins of the ancient city. Section 1. The shadow of the market city wakes slowly in the thin, grey light of morning. Not the grand avenues or the palaces first, no, they are still in shadow. Instead, it is the narrow lanes along the old walls that stir first. Here, in the margins, life begins earlier because it must. There is a bakery on the corner, not the sort visited by the wealthy, but the kind that opens its doors before the rest of the city has even rubbed the sleep from its eyes. The oven inside is deep and blackened from years of ash and heat. The baker, a thin man whose hair is always dusty with flour, has already been awake for hours. He works with the grain no one else wanted, the rough barley that grinds coarsely between the stones. When kneaded into dough, it forms loaves that are dense and dark, loaves that fill the belly, if not the imagination. In the street outside, people gather with baskets. There are no coins exchanged here, at least not often. Bread is traded for eggs, for a small bundle of leeks, for the promise of help later in the day. The city's officials and merchants speak of prices and taxes, but here food has its own language of barter and debt. A woman arrives with 2 children in tow, their eyes still heavy from sleep. She hands the baker a handful of beans shriveled, but still good if boiled long enough. In return, she receives a loaf still warm from the oven, its crust so thick it will take effort to break. The children clutch it as if it were treasure. They do not yet know that, by the end of the day, the bread will be gone, and the hunger will return. The smells of the market are still far away, the perfumes of fresh herbs, roasting meats, and honeyed cakes that the central square will later display. Here, in the outskirts, the scent is humbler, steam from cooking pots, the faint bitterness of boiled greens, the sharp tang of onions frying in cheap oil. By midday, the market's edges will fill with those who cannot afford its center. These are the sellers of scraps, small bones with shreds of meat still clinging, bruised fruit, and handfuls of olives so salty they seem almost to burn the tongue. The wealthy will pass without glancing, their eyes fixed on stalls piled high with imported spices or plump fish brought in from the coast. But for those in the margins, this is where survival is negotiated. In the late afternoon, when the sun leans low against the rooftops, you might see a small gathering near the cistern. A man with an old copper pot ladles out a thin stew into clay bowls. No one asks who paid for it, though everyone knows. Sometimes it is a temple offering the gods' way of feeding those the city forgets. Other times it is simply the kindness of someone who had more than they needed that day. And when night comes, the market sleeps, but the hunger does not. In the silence, the city's poorest dream of food, not feasts, not abundance, but a loaf that lasts more than a single day, a pot that never quite empties. Section 2. The work of hunger. Hunger is a quiet worker in the ancient city. It moves through its streets at dawn, before the shop shutters are raised and the bakers' ovens send up their first smoke. It has no voice, but it leaves signs: a tighter belt, a hand lingering over a loaf it cannot buy, the faint dizziness that makes one lean against a wall before continuing to walk, For those living in the city's margins, every day begins with a calculation. What might be eaten today and at what cost? This is not just the cost of coin, though coin matters. It is also the cost of waiting, of walking further, of trading labor for scraps. There are men and women who work an entire morning for a hill of bread and a small cup of watered wine. The transaction made without words, because everyone knows the exchange well. The work of hunger is often invisible to those in the center of the city, where food markets overflow and banquets spill late into the night. But in the outer streets where the paving stones are broken and the walls are patched with mismatched brick, food is never simply food. It is a prize, an anchor, and sometimes a debt. You might walk past the day workers, their hands stained a permanent purple or blue, and smell the faint, bitter tang of their vats. They eat little during the day, often nothing, but a crust tucked into a cloth, nibbled while waiting for the cloth to take its color. They cannot afford to soil better bread with the smell of dye. It would make eating worse. The baker's apprentice in these quarters rises before the sun to tend a fire that is not his own. Baking bread he will not taste until it is stale. In the alleys near the tannery, hunger has a different face. Workers there chew mint leaves when they can find them, to mask the constant smell of hides. Meals are simple barley bread, lentils, onions, foods that can be eaten quickly, standing up, before returning to work. Here, hunger is managed like an unwelcome visitor, not banished, but kept at a tolerable distance. Even water, in the margins, comes at a cost. In the lower districts, wells run dry more quickly in summer, and those who cannot pay for delivered water must walk long distances to public fountains. On such walks, it is common to see a person pause not for rest, but to search the ground for any dropped fig or grain. A child might run ahead, chasing what he thinks is a plum, only to return holding a lump of clay. Markets here are not like those in the center. There are no tables piled high with olives glistening in oil, no pyramids of figs under woven awnings. Instead, sellers squat on the ground with baskets half filled, a handful of broad beans, 2 onions, a small fish already beginning to lose its shine. Prices shift by the hour. If a seller has only 1 fish left at midday, it may be sold for a fraction of its worth, rather than risk it rotting by evening. Those who cannot buy early in the day must gamble on what remains. Sometimes the burden of hunger presses hardest not on the stomach, but on pride. To beg openly is a shame in the ancient city, so the hungry often devise other means, offering to carry a stranger's bundle in exchange for a crust, pretending to admire a merchant's goods until he, in good humor, offers a taste. In the quieter courtyards, neighbors will pass food without words, leaving a basket by a door or placing an extra loaf in a shared oven. These gestures are not charity, but a kind of unspoken pact. Today I help you, tomorrow you may help me. Even the scraps from the grand houses find their way here. Servants sometimes smuggle leftover bread or bones to relatives in the margins, the food wrapped in cloths so as not to be recognized. Such transfers are risky stealing from a household. Even if it is food destined for the pigs, can bring harsh punishment. But hunger sharpens courage as well as need. Tonight, the city's margins quiet sooner than its heart. The wealthy may feast until the lamps burn low, but here, after a simple meal, perhaps barley stew, a wedge of cheese, and a few olives, the household settles quickly. Hunger does not leave, but it waits in the corners, ready to begin its work. Again with the morning light, for those who live in the margins, eating is not just an act of nourishment. It is an act of endurance, a daily negotiation with labor, luck, and the invisible weight of need. And in this negotiation, there is no surplus, no luxury, only the fragile hope that tomorrow will bring enough. Section 3. Ashes in the pot and bread at dawn. The city sleeps differently in its forgotten corners. Here, near the edge of the walls where the towers are little more than cracked stone, and the watchmen pass less often, the night does not fully settle. Even after the taverns near the docks close, there is movement, shadows along the alleys, the muffled thud of a boot, the creak of a cart pushed far too late into the dark. And here, in one of the narrowest streets where even moonlight hesitates to enter, an old cook keeps his fire going. His name is no longer remembered by many, though his stew has warmed the stomachs of more tired workers than anyone can count. The pot is the same one he has used for decades, its inside seasoned by years of fat and grain, and he stirs it now with a hand that no longer trembles. Practice has made his movements steady despite age. What goes into the pot is rarely the same. Sometimes fish heads brought by a boy from the harbor, sometimes bones from the market's discarded piles, a pinch of barley when it can be spared, salt if fortune smiles, and always the water is drawn from the same well just inside the city. Gate cold, tasting faintly of stone. Tonight, he has added a fistful of wild herbs from the empty lot behind the abandoned shrine. They will give the broth a green scent that hides the thinness of the meal. A woman arrives first, carrying a cloth bundle. She trades him a small flatbread in return for a ladle of the stew. She eats it standing, steam rising into the chill air. Then comes a dockhand, still smelling of river water. He drops 2 copper coins in the bowl by the hearth and drinks his portion in silence. As the hours deepen toward dawn, more arrive: night guards finishing their shift, washerwomen with damp skirts, children who have learned the sound of the ladle on the pot. They eat leaning against the doorway, their eyes half closed, savoring the warmth more than the taste. The old cook says little. He has no need for conversation at this hour, but he watches the faces of those who come and go, reading in them the quiet relief that comes from eating before sleep. His fire keeps the darkness at bay for just long enough to make the city feel like it still belongs to them. By the time the eastern sky begins to pale, the pot is nearly empty. He pours the last of the stew into a jar for the girl who always comes just before sunrise, the one whose father is too proud to let her beg during daylight. She thanks him softly, then disappears into the waking streets. He takes the pot from the fire and sets it aside, letting the ashes settle. There will be more tomorrow, never the same, never quite enough, but always there. In a city that forgets, So many. The taste of warm broth in the early hours is a small reminder that someone, somewhere, is still willing to feed you. Story 6. What if you had to eat in ancient Greek times? Section 1. Bread, olives, and the quiet chore of staying elevate is morning, but the light is soft still tinted with the cool grey of night. The air smells faintly of smoke and not the rich, fragrant kind from roasting meat, but the stale, lingering scent of last night's fire, now only embers under a thin drift of ash. Somewhere outside, you hear the muffled sound of a broom scraping across a stone threshold, the steady, unhurried rhythm of another household beginning its day. Your own breakfast will not be much. It rarely is. On the low table before you lies the same arrangement you saw yesterday, and the day before that. A small clay plate with a few wrinkled olives, some black, some green, an uneven wedge of cheese, and bread so coarse that its crust feels more like wood than wheat. The loaf is not soft and light, but heavy and dense, its surface freckled with bits of barley husk that survived the grinding. You run your hand along its edge, feeling where the flour was not fully sifted, where the millstone's uneven grit left tiny fragments that will crunch between your teeth. There is no hurry to eat. In Greek times, the first meal of the day is less a pleasure than a necessity, a quiet preparation for work. You will not be full, people rarely are, but you will be able to keep going. You pour a little watered wine into a clay cup, watching the dark red clouds slowly swirl and lighten. Wine at breakfast is not for celebration. It is for safety. Water alone can be untrustworthy, especially when drawn from a public fountain that serves dozens of families. The wine, thin and sour though it is, helps keep illness at bay. Beside you, on a low stool, sits a small wicker basket half filled with figs from yesterday's market. They are already beginning to soften in the heat, the skin splitting in tiny places where the sweetness pushes through. You could eat one now, but you hold back. A fig eaten in the morning is gone too quickly. A fig eaten in the late afternoon is almost a reward. You tear a piece of bread, dip it into a shallow dish of olive oil, and chew slowly. The oil is cloudy, with tiny flecks of leaf and skin, and it tastes faintly bitter, a reminder that not all olives are pressed at their best. But it is still precious, and you eat with care. Outside, the street begins to fill with sound. Traders calling out their wares. A potter tapping his wares to show their strength. The clop of a donkey's hooves on uneven stone. Somewhere in the background, the slow rhythmic clanging of a blacksmith's hammer on metal. By the time you finish, your stomach is neither empty nor full. You have eaten enough to face the morning, but not enough to forget hunger entirely. That, in ancient Greek times, is a kind of balance, and as you rise, you glance once more at the little basket of figs, half tempted, but you leave them there. Some things are better saved for later. Section 2. The daily tablet morning begins without rush. The first light comes not with the blare of horns or the call of engines, but with a soft grey over the tiled rooftops. The marketplace is still quiet, save for the distant sound of a mule's hoofs on stone. You are hungry, But hunger is a different sort of thing here, more a background hunt than an urgent cry. The meal that starts your day is not what you once called breakfast. It is no pile of eggs or fried bread. Instead, you might find yourself with a small piece of barley bread, coarse and dense. Yesterday's loaf cut from the cooling stack and still tasting faintly of smoke from the oven. It is dipped in watered wine oinos thinned so that it does not warm the head, or in a little bowl of olive oil sprinkled with herbs. The oil is green and sharp, but precious. You take it sparingly, aware that the jar at home is not bottomless. If the sea has been kind and the fisherman returned early, you might have a tiny fish, salted and preserved, eaten whole except for the bones too stiff to chew. But most mornings bring no such bounty. Most mornings the bread is enough. Later in the day you may pass through the agora again. This is not only a place for buying and selling, it is where news passes, where disputes are argued, where the scent of grilled meat drifts from the stalls of those who can afford such luxuries. The meat is rarely beef, too costly, too valuable to be eaten without ceremony. Goat is more common, or pork if the butcher has slaughtered a pig that morning. But for most citizens, meat is a festival food, not a daily one. On ordinary days, the mouth-watering smell of roasting is something you inhale but do not taste. The midday meal, Ariston, is still modest. Bread again, perhaps softer if the baker has milled the grain finely. Some olives, wrinkled and black, served in a shallow clay dish. A wedge of cheese, made from goat's milk, tangy and crumbling. In summer, there might be figs fresh, warm from the sun, their sweetness almost enough to make you forget the salt-heavy bread. But the real meal, the one people speak of and plan for, comes at the end of the day. It is called Diaplon, and it happens when the work is finished and the air cools. The table is low, and you do not sit so much as recline, propped on a cushion. The food is set out all at once: bread, beans stewed in clay pots, boiled greens, a stew of lentils, thickened with onions. If fortune smiles, there might be fish roasted on skewers, brushed with oil and garlic. The wine flows more freely now, but still mixed with water. The meal is not hurried. Conversation drifts from the weather to the latest decree from the assembly, to the gossip about who owes whom a favor. There are no forks. You eat with your hands, using pieces of bread as scoops. The oil on your fingers smells of rosemary, and the bread is warm from the hearth. As the lamps are lit and the shadows lengthen, the table becomes less about eating and more about being together. The food is plain, but it binds the day. Each bite is a quiet reminder that in this place, survival is not about abundance but about balance, knowing how much to take, how much to save, and how much to share. Section 3. When the day's eating was done by the time the sun slid behind the hills and the air began to cool, the day's eating was almost over. Ancient Greek life did not have our constant grazing, midnight snacks, or streaming cooked meals. It was contained, deliberate, and quiet. Supper diapnon was the final act of the day, and it was as much about closing the hours as it was about filling the stomach. In the wealthier homes of Athens, supper was a social affair. Men might recline on couches, propped up on an elbow, arranged around low tables with painted pottery dishes. Women, in most city-states, ate separately or with their children. The evening symposium, the drinking party, was for men and their chosen company. The food itself, unless you were hosting an exceptional feast, would not surprise you. There might be leftover bread from the morning, soaked in wine or broth to soften it. Perhaps boiled greens again, with a drizzle of oil and a pinch of salt, if you were lucky enough to still have some. Fish, if the day's catch had been good and your purse could bear it. In poorer households, the evening meal was almost indistinguishable from lunch sometimes. Just a bowl of barley porridge, a heel of bread, maybe a slice of onion or a bit of cheese if a goat in the neighborhood had been milked that day. A small dish of olives would stand nearby, their glossy skins catching the flicker of the lamp. The wine, often watered down heavily, was not meant for intoxication, but for hydration and a small comfort before bed. The diapnon also marked a threshold. After it, the household closed up. Lamps were trimmed, embers in the hearth banked for the night. Stray cats, already prowling in the alleyways, might press their faces against the wooden shutters, smelling the last traces of cooked lentils or fish bones. Outside, the streets fell to darkness quickly. Only a few carried torches, and night was considered a time best faced indoors. If you were in the countryside, the evening meal might be taken on a bench outside, watching the last light fade over the fields. There would be little to see, maybe the silhouette of an olive tree against the deepening blue, the far-off call of a shepherd to his flock. Chickens would already be roosting. A dog might curl at your feet, its ears pricking toward distant sounds. And after the eating was done, there was no lingering with cups of tea or plates of sweets. There was no dessert beyond what the season provided. A few figs, a slice of melon, a handful of nuts. The rhythms of eating in ancient Greece were inseparable from the rhythms of work and light. You ate when there was food, and when the day allowed. There were no late-night bakeries to slip into, no ice boxes to open in the dark. Your hunger at bedtime was simply part of life, sometimes satisfied, sometimes not. Yet there was a strange satisfaction in that final quiet. You knew exactly what you had eaten and how it had come to your table, whether through your own labor, a neighbor's trade, or the open hand of the gods. The lamp's flame would dance over the clay walls one last time, and then the house would fall silent. Outside, the cicadas might still sing in the summer heat, or the winter wind might press against the door, and you, with the day's food behind you, would turn toward the night, your belly neither heavy nor entirely full, but enough to carry you until the first bread of morning.